Let's begin here, because this is where the shift really happens. When a narcissist encounters authenticity, what they experience first is not admiration. It's not inspiration, it's exposure, and that's a very uncomfortable place for them to be. An authentic person walks into a room differently. They are not performing, they are not scanning for approval, they are not shifting to match whoever is in front of them. There's a steadiness there, a congruence. What they say aligns with what they feel. What they feel aligns with how they act. There's no excessive polishing of image, no frantic need to control perception. To a narcissist, that kind of presence is destabilizing. Because authenticity functions like a mirror, and not the flattering kind. It reflects back the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. Narcissism is built on a carefully constructed false self, a performance of superiority, confidence, moral righteousness, success, charm. It's armor, it's scaffolding, it's survival, but it's not solid. When someone grounded and self-aware stands in front of them, the contrast becomes visible. Your calmness highlights their volatility, your emotional literacy highlights their avoidance, your secure sense of self highlights their fragile ego. And here's the part people often misunderstand. The narcissist may not consciously think, this person is exposing me. It's often a visceral reaction. A tightening, an irritation, a subtle sense of being threatened. You might notice it as a shift in tone, a slight edge in their voice, a dismissive comment when you share something vulnerable but measured. Or perhaps they suddenly compete with your story. You talk about a challenge you overcame, and instead of connection, they respond with a bigger, better story. That's not coincidence, that's regulation, because authenticity makes them feel small. And feeling small is intolerable to someone whose entire personality structure is organized around avoiding shame. You see, authenticity requires self-acceptance. It requires acknowledging imperfections without collapsing. It requires saying, yes, I have flaws, yes, I've made mistakes, and I am still okay. That kind of internal stability is foreign to someone who survives by denying weakness at all costs. So when you show up and say something like, I don't know, without defensiveness or that hurt me, without accusation or this is who I am, without apology, you are modeling something they cannot access, and instead of curiosity, what often arises is envy. Not the obvious kind, not the dramatic kind, but a quiet, corrosive envy. They may admire your confidence publicly while privately resenting how effortless it seems. They may compliment your self-assurance while internally questioning why they have to work so hard to maintain theirs. Authenticity also removes the usual hooks they rely on. Manipulation requires insecurity. Gaslighting requires doubt. Control requires emotional instability. When you are grounded, when you trust your perceptions, when you don't need constant validation, there's less to grab onto. And that feels dangerous, because if they cannot control how you see yourself, they cannot control the dynamic. Sometimes the response is subtle undermining, small criticisms masked as jokes, backhanded compliments, tiny attempts to chip away at your certainty. It's a way to restore equilibrium, to bring you down just enough so they don't feel so exposed. Other times, it's more direct. They may question your motives, suggest you're too much, accuse you of being self-righteous or cold or overly sensitive. These are not accurate reflections of you. They are projections of their discomfort. Authenticity disrupts the power imbalance they rely on. And here's something important. The more consistent you are, the stronger this reaction becomes, because authenticity is not a one-time declaration. It's sustained alignment. It's continuing to show up the same way even when pressured to perform differently. That consistency makes the exposure ongoing. Over time, the narcissist may feel chronically unsettled around you. They might describe you as intimidating, even if you're gentle. They might say you make them feel judged, even if you've said nothing critical. That's because your presence alone highlights what they work tirelessly to conceal. It's not that you're attacking them. It's that you're not participating in the illusion. And when someone refuses to participate in the illusion weakens. This is why authenticity is powerful, not loud, not aggressive, not confrontational, just steady, clear, real, and in the presence of someone who survives on distortion, reality feels like exposure. When a narcissist encounters authenticity, they don't see a threat because you are powerful, they feel a threat because you are real. And nothing unsettles a false self more than the quiet strength of the truth standing in front of it. Now, after that initial exposure, after they feel that unsettling mirror effect of your authenticity, something interesting often happens. They don't immediately attack it, they study it. Because here's the thing about narcissistic personalities, they are highly attuned to what works. They watch, they observe, they gather data, and when they see that authenticity draws connection, respect, even admiration, they don't necessarily reject it right away. They try to replicate it. In the early stages, this can feel almost magical. You might think, wow, they really get me. Suddenly, they're using the same language you use. They're talking about growth. They're discussing childhood wounds. They're sharing what sounds like vulnerability. They may even say, I've never opened up to anyone like this before. It feels intimate. It feels aligned. It feels like you've met someone operating on the same emotional frequency. But here's where we need to slow down. Authenticity is not just sharing personal information. It's not just saying emotional words. It's not just recounting trauma. Authenticity is integration. It's insight plus accountability plus behavioral consistency over time. And that's the part that can't be faked for long. What a narcissist often does is mirror your authenticity. They reflect your values back to you. If you value honesty, suddenly honesty becomes their highest principle. If you talk about boundaries, they claim they admire boundaries. If you emphasize emotional depth, they suddenly present themselves as profoundly introspective. It's adaptive, it's strategic, and most of the time, it's not even fully conscious. It's more like a survival reflex. This is what this person responds to. I will become that. But mirroring is not embodiment. You may notice subtle discrepancies. They talk about accountability, but when confronted with a small mistake, they deflect. They speak about emotional maturity, but during conflict, they become reactive or cold. They describe themselves as healed, but patterns of manipulation quietly persist. At first, these inconsistencies are easy to dismiss. We all have bad days. We all fall short sometimes. That's human. The difference is in the pattern. Authenticity deepens over time, mirroring eventually fractures. Because sustaining authenticity requires self-reflection, and self-reflection requires tolerating shame. It requires looking at parts of yourself that are uncomfortable, and for someone organized around avoiding shame at all costs, that's where the performance begins to crack. You may start to feel confused, but they said they valued honesty. They told me they wanted growth. They claimed they were working on themselves. And yet, when you gently point out a behavior that hurt you, the reaction is defensive or dismissive. Or they turn it back on you. That's when you begin to see the difference between borrowed language and lived truth. The narcissistic system can learn the vocabulary of authenticity, but it struggles to tolerate the vulnerability that sustains it. And here's why this stage can be particularly destabilizing for you. Because when someone mirrors your authenticity, it creates a powerful bond. You feel seen, understood, matched. It activates hope. It activates attachment. You believe you're building something real. And when the cracks begin to show, it's hard to reconcile, but the cracks are the information. Over time, the mirroring requires increasing effort. They may grow irritated that you expect consistency. They may accuse you of being demanding when you reference earlier conversations. They may even suggest that you are the one being inauthentic. That's projection, because your steady alignment highlights the difference between performance and integration. And here's the part I want you to really hear. Mirroring is not transformation. Someone can intellectually understand authenticity without emotionally integrating it. They can describe healing without doing the work. They can perform vulnerability without risking exposure. Eventually, sustaining the imitation becomes exhausting. The mask slips during stress, during conflict, during moments when their ego feels threatened. And when that happens, You see something very different from the early reflection you fell for. You see the fragility underneath. That doesn't mean the early moments were entirely fabricated. Sometimes there are genuine glimpses. But without the capacity for ongoing self-examination, those glimpses cannot solidify into lasting change. Authenticity is not a costume you put on when it's advantageous. It's a structure you build from the inside out. And when a narcissist encounters authenticity, they may try to borrow its shape, but without doing the inner work, they cannot sustain its substance. Because authenticity cannot be imitated into existence, it can only be lived. And eventually, the difference becomes undeniable. Now, once the mirroring starts to crack, once the performance becomes harder to sustain, we move into a very different phase of this dynamic. And this is where your authenticity becomes even more disruptive. Because authenticity is not just about being emotionally honest. It's about having boundaries, and boundaries change everything. An authentic person doesn't just say, "This is who I am." They also say, "And this is what I will and will not accept." There's clarity there, there's self-respect there, and for someone who relies on control to stabilize their fragile sense of self, that clarity can feel like a direct threat. At first, they may test it subtly. You express a need, maybe it's about communication, maybe it's about respect, and they brush it off. They tease you about being too sensitive. They minimize it. They promise to adjust but don't follow through. These are small boundary probes. They're assessing, will this person hold their line? When you do, calmly, without drama, something shifts. Because narcissistic dynamics depend on flexibility in one direction, yours, they rely on you adjusting, accommodating, over-explaining, second, guessing yourself. When you remain steady and say, "No, that doesn't work for me," without hostility, without apology, it interrupts the script. And interruption creates instability. You may notice escalation. The tone changes. What was once charming becomes irritated. What was once attentive becomes cold. They might accuse you of being controlling simply because you won't be controlled. They may frame your boundary as an attack. This is important. When someone experiences your boundary as aggression, it often means they benefited from your lack of one before. Boundaries remove access, and when someone feels entitled to access to your time, your emotional labor, your flexibility, the removal of that access feels like loss of power. You might see gaslighting emerge more clearly at this stage. That's not what happened. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. Why? Because if they can destabilize your perception, they can weaken your boundary. Doubt is the doorway back in. But authenticity includes trusting your internal experience. It includes saying, "I know what I felt." And that is incredibly destabilizing for someone who depends on rewriting reality to maintain control. Sometimes the response isn't gaslighting, it's punishment, silent treatment, withdrawal of affection. Sudden distance. This isn't random moodiness, it's behavioral conditioning. The message is subtle but powerful. When you assert yourself, you lose connection. And that's where many people begin to bend, because humans are wired for attachment. We don't like disconnection. We don't like coldness, so we soften our boundary just a little to restore warmth. But when you don't, when you maintain your clarity despite the discomfort, you fundamentally alter the dynamic. Here's the truth. Narcissistic systems are structured around dominance and submission, even if it's subtle. Not always loud control, but psychological positioning. When you assert boundaries consistently, you remove yourself from that hierarchy. You stop participating in the unspoken power struggle, and that's deeply threatening because control is regulation for them. If they can predict you, influence you, steer your reactions, they feel stable. When they cannot, when you remain grounded and self-directed, they feel exposed and unmoored. This is often the moment when they accuse you of changing. And in a way, you've shifted from accommodating to aligned. You've shifted from seeking approval to seeking congruence. But here's the deeper layer. Your boundary also forces them to confront themselves. When you say, "I won't tolerate being spoken to that way," you are implicitly naming behavior. You are holding up that mirror again. And this time, it's not just about image, it's about conduct, and that can trigger shame. Remember, Shame is the emotion they organize their personality to avoid. So instead of processing it, they externalize it, they project it, they turn you into the problem. You're too rigid, you're impossible to please, you always need something. But what you're actually doing is simple. You're protecting your emotional space. Boundaries are not ultimatums. They're not threats, they're not punishments, they are statements of self-respect followed by consistent action. And consistency is what makes them powerful. Over time, one of two things happens. Either the person adapts, which requires genuine self-reflection, or the dynamic intensifies. Because when control fails, escalation often follows. But no matter what unfolds next, this is the turning point. When authenticity is paired with boundaries, manipulation loses its grip. And when manipulation loses its grip, the illusion of control begins to collapse. Because a narcissistic dynamic cannot survive where clarity stands firm. And nothing disrupts control more than someone who calmly knows their worth and refuses to negotiate it. And when control begins to collapse, when your boundaries remain steady, when the mirroring no longer works, when the subtle manipulations don't destabilize you, we arrive at something much deeper and far more intense. This is where narcissistic injury enters the picture. Now I want to be very clear about this. Narcissistic injury is not the same as ordinary hurt feelings. We all experience disappointment, embarrassment, even shame at times, but we can metabolize it. We reflect, we recalibrate, we move forward. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, injury strikes at the core of their identity structure. Their sense of self is not built on stable self-worth. It's built on superiority, control, admiration, or at the very least, the avoidance of feeling small. When your authenticity remains intact, when you don't collapse, don't comply, don't validate a distorted narrative, it punctures that fragile construction. And that puncture feels catastrophic. It might not look catastrophic on the surface. It might look like a sudden cold shift. A withdrawal of warmth, a sharp comment that feels disproportionate, but underneath what's happening is an ego wound. You are no longer reflecting back the image they need to see. Maybe you calmly call out an inconsistency. Maybe you say, that's not what happened. Maybe you refuse to take responsibility for something that isn't yours. In that moment, you are disrupting the inflated self-image that keeps them psychologically intact. And when that image is threatened, the response can be swift and severe. You may see devaluation. The same qualities they once admired in you suddenly become flaws. Your independence becomes selfishness. Your emotional awareness becomes overthinking. Your confidence becomes arrogance. This isn't random, it's defensive restructuring. If they can diminish you, they can restore themselves. Sometimes it escalates further, character attacks, revisionist history. They may rewrite the story of the relationship entirely. What was once, you're the best thing that ever happened to me, becomes you were always difficult. This isn't about truth. It's about regulation. Because accepting that you are grounded and they are reacting would require self-examination. And self-examination opens the door to shame. Shame is intolerable here. So instead of feeling, they externalize. Instead of reflecting, they retaliate. And here's the part that can be incredibly confusing. The intensity of the reaction often feels out of proportion to what actually happened. You may think, all I did was state a boundary, or all I did was correct something inaccurate. But to them, that small act represents a collapse of control. Narcissistic injury often brings rage, not always explosive rage. Sometimes it's icy, calculated rage. Sometimes it's social retaliation, smear campaigns, subtle triangulation, sudden alliances formed against you. Sometimes it's abrupt discard, but make no mistake, the energy is coming from injury. Your authenticity has created a rupture in the illusion of dominance. And here's something important to understand. Injury doesn't mean insight. Just because someone reacts strongly doesn't mean they are becoming self-aware. In fact, the opposite is often true. The stronger the injury, the more rigid the defenses become. You might even feel tempted to soothe them. to soften your stance, to reassure them that you didn't mean to challenge them, and that instinct is human. We don't like seeing others distressed, but this is not your wound to repair, because the wound wasn't caused by cruelty. It was caused by reality. You remained aligned with truth, and truth, when it collides with a false self, creates friction. This is why many authentic people begin to feel exhausted at this stage. You're not just managing conflict. You're managing someone's ego structure reacting to the loss of control. It's heavy, it's destabilizing, and it can make you question yourself. But stay anchored here. Injury is evidence that the dynamic has shifted. You are no longer playing the assigned role. You are no longer cushioning their fragility. You are no longer participating in distortion to maintain peace. And when that happens, the narcissistic system scrambles to reassert equilibrium, sometimes through charm again, sometimes through threat, sometimes through disappearance, but all of it stems from the same source, the collapse of the reflected grandiose self. Your authenticity didn't attack them. It simply refused to support the illusion, and when illusion loses its support, it cracks. Narcissistic injury is not about your cruelty. It's about their inability to tolerate a reality that doesn't center them. And when truth becomes the trigger, you know you've stepped out of the distortion for good. So after the injury, after the ego has been punctured and the illusion destabilized, the system has recalibrate, and this is where you often see a decisive shift. Because once a narcissist realizes that you cannot be controlled, reshaped, or destabilized in the ways they're accustomed to, they move toward one of two strategies: escalation or withdrawal. Let's talk about escalation first. When subtle tactics fail, the behavior often intensifies. The charm may disappear completely. What was once passive, aggressive becomes overtly critical. What was once indirect manipulation becomes blatant control attempts. The energy sharpens. You might experience increased arguments over minor issues, sudden ultimatums. Emotional punishment. They may attempt to provoke you intentionally, saying things they know will trigger you, testing whether they can still get a reaction. Why? Because reaction equals access. If they can make you angry, defensive, tearful, confused, they can reassure themselves that they still have influence. Emotional destabilization becomes proof of power. You may also see public maneuvers, smear campaigns, subtle character assassinations framed as concern, triangulation, bringing other people into the dynamic to create jealousy or competition. These are not random acts of cruelty. They are attempts to regain equilibrium by reestablishing dominance. And here's what makes this phase particularly challenging. The escalation can feel shocking. You may think, where did this come from? But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from losing control. When authenticity stands firm, manipulation becomes less efficient. And when manipulation becomes less efficient, force increases. But there's another path they may take: withdrawal. Sometimes instead of escalating, they disengage. They go cold, they detach abruptly, they ghost, or they orchestrate a discard that feels swift and disorienting. This can be just as destabilizing as escalation, sometimes more, because the message embedded in withdrawal is this: if I cannot control you, I will remove you. They may replace you quickly. Display new relationships publicly, perform indifference. It can feel like you were erased, but understand this clearly: withdrawal is not indifference. It is avoidance, avoidance of exposure, avoidance of accountability, avoidance of the ongoing mirror your authenticity provides. If staying means continually confronting their fragility, leaving becomes self-protection, not mature self-protection, but ego protection. Both escalation and withdrawal stem from the same core truth. Authenticity forces a choice: growth or retreat. And growth requires something they may not be equipped or willing to do. It requires looking inward without collapsing. It requires tolerating shame long enough to integrate it. It requires relinquishing control as a regulatory strategy. That's deep psychological work, and most narcissistic systems are structured specifically to avoid that depth. So instead, they double down or disappear. Now here's where your clarity matters most, because escalation can tempt you to fight back harder. Withdrawal can tempt you to chase. Both reactions pull you back into the dynamic. Escalation says, prove yourself. Withdrawal says, earn your place. But authenticity doesn't chase, and it doesn't compete. Authenticity observes and decides. If someone escalates in response to your boundaries, that is data. If someone withdraws when they can't control you, that is also data. And painful as it may be, it's clarifying. You begin to see that the relationship was sustainable only under conditions of distortion, only when you were slightly smaller, slightly more accommodating, slightly more unsure. The moment you stood in alignment with yourself, the structure became unstable, and that tells you something essential. It was never built on mutual growth. It was built on asymmetry. Now, this doesn't mean there's no grief. There often is. Especially if there were good moments, moments of apparent connection, moments where you believed change was possible. But escalation and withdrawal are both responses to lost control, not to lost love. And when you understand that, something shifts inside you. You stop personalizing their exit or their aggression. You start recognizing it as a system reacting to disruption. Authenticity does not guarantee someone will grow. It guarantees that the illusion cannot continue uninterrupted. And when faced with truth, some people rise, others retreat, but either way, the dynamic cannot remain the same. Because once control no longer works, the mask either hardens or it falls. And when someone chooses escalation or disappearance over growth, that tells you everything you need to know about what they were truly protecting. And after all of that, the mirroring, the boundary testing, the injury, the escalation, or the withdrawal, we arrive at something that often gets overlooked in these conversations. We spend so much time analyzing their reactions that we forget to examine what your authenticity has actually done for you. Because here's the quiet truth: authenticity protects you, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, not with fireworks or grand declarations, but in steady, psychological ways that build resilience over time. When you are authentic, you are anchored. You know what you feel, you know what you value, you know what you will tolerate and what you won't. That internal alignment becomes your compass. And when someone tries to distort reality, when they gaslight, minimize, deflect, you may still feel shaken, but you are far less likely to abandon yourself. That's protection. Authenticity shortens confusion cycles. You don't stay stuck for years trying to decode behavior that consistently violates your standards. You may give chances, you may hope, you may grieve, but eventually your internal compass pulls you back to center. It whispers, this doesn't align, and you listen. It also protects you from over-personalizing their reactions. When you understand that escalation was about control and withdrawal was about avoidance, you stop interpreting those behaviors as reflections of your worth. You begin to see them as reflections of their limitations. That shift is profound because narcissistic dynamics often leave people feeling defective. If only I were calmer, if only I were less sensitive, if only I tried harder. But authenticity disrupts that narrative. It says, I am allowed to have needs, I am allowed to expect respect, I am allowed to exist without shrinking. And when that belief solidifies, manipulation loses traction. Authenticity also changes who you attract. It doesn't eliminate unhealthy people entirely. They may still be drawn to grounded individuals, but it makes it much harder for them to stay undetected. The red flags feel louder, the inconsistencies stand out sooner, your nervous system becomes more attuned to subtle dissonance. You start recognizing that charm without consistency is just performance, that intensity without accountability is instability, that apologies without change are strategies, that awareness is protective, and here's something even deeper. When you remain authentic in the face of distortion, you strengthen your relationship with yourself. Every time you hold a boundary, every time you refuse to internalize blame that isn't yours, every time you walk away instead of chasing clarity from someone unwilling to give it, you reinforce self-trust. Self-trust is the antidote to narcissistic dynamics. because control thrives where there is doubt. And the more you trust your internal experience, the less susceptible you become to someone else's rewritten narrative. Now, does authenticity mean you never get hurt? Of course not. You will still feel disappointment. You will still feel grief. You may still feel anger. Being grounded does not make you immune to pain, but it does mean you recover differently. You don't spiral into self-erasure. You don't contort yourself trying to regain approval. You don't sacrifice your core values to keep someone comfortable. Instead, you recalibrate. You say, "This hurt, and I am still me." And that steadiness is powerful. Because in the end, when a narcissist encounters authenticity, the outcome may vary for them. Escalation, retreat, retaliation, but for you, something solidifies. You see more clearly. You tolerate less distortion. You align more deeply with who you are. And perhaps most importantly, you stop confusing intensity with intimacy, control with care, and chaos with passion. Authenticity doesn't guarantee that others will rise to meet you, but it guarantees that you will not abandon yourself to keep them. And when you no longer abandon yourself, the dynamic loses its grip entirely. Because the strongest protection you will ever have against manipulation is this: knowing who you are and refusing to negotiate it.